Now let's shift our focus to Africa, just like India seems to be doing. India's External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar is on a 6-day visit to the continent. He began with a 3-day trip to Uganda and now he's in Mozambique. Mozambique is a country of about 31 million people. It's located in southeastern Africa. Jaishankar is there to foster ties. When he arrived yesterday, he was given what he calls an energetic welcome. Then he took a train ride. What's so special about this? It's a made-in-India train. This was with Mozambique's Transport Minister, Mateus Magala. They even conducted a press conference on the moving train. Jaishankar called it a novel experience. He then interacted with the Indian diaspora in the country. He spoke about historic ties between the two nations. These ties go back centuries, and they've been given a boost of late. On the economic front, there's, of course, the Made in India train that Jaishankar was on. He also virtually inaugurated a bridge in Mozambique. It's called the Buzi Bridge. It's more than 700 meters long. It was funded by an Indian line of credit. But India's Africa outreach is not just limited to development projects. There are other avenues of cooperation like defense. Last month, India hosted the first ever India-Africa Army Chiefs Conclave. 31 African nations sent their chiefs or representatives. It was a bid to both improve ties and talk about arms exports. You see, most African nations import arms and ammunition, and India is trying to become a global defense exporter. So it makes sense for India to explore this market. And this market is opening up. Presently, Africa primarily imports weapons from Russia. Russian arms made up about 40% of Africa's defense imports between 2018 and 2022. But of course, Russia is currently busy with its own war, the war in Ukraine. It may not be able to spare arms for export. So India could try and fill that gap. India reportedly exports only about 10 to 15% of its arms to Africa at the moment. New Delhi could try and increase its slice of the pie. And it may be something that appeals to African nations as well, considering the shared history. Take a look at this. Images from this morning, Jaishankar paying homage to Mozambique's freedom struggle. India and almost all African nations share a history of colonial oppression. While India shook off the British yoke in 1947, Mozambique gained independence from Portugal only in 1975. European nations exploited Africa for centuries. It was called the Scramble for Africa, and it left the continent impoverished. The effects of that scramble continue to scar Africa and to shape its present partnerships. Most former colonizers have a disproportionate presence in Africa, and it does lead to tensions. Look at what happened in Burkina Faso recently. Locals protested the French military presence in the country. France finally had to withdraw its troops in February, but not without giving a parting shot. Paris was critical of Moscow's influence in Africa. It said Russia was trying to make inroads into the continent, trying to expand its military influence. It sounds a bit too much like colonial times for comfort. Europeans bickering over who controls what in Africa. But India could offer something different, a partnership based on mutual respect, a coming together of the so-called global South, instead of nations once again becoming pawns in the great power games. That is what India is working towards, and Jaishankar's trip is another step in that direction. Brazil's President Lula da Silva is visiting China, and usually diplomatic visits are a boring affair. They stick to a usual pattern: the bilateral meetings, the signing of agreements, photo ops, and leaders waving at cameras. But President Lula is breaking away from tradition. Last evening, he took everyone by surprise. He launched a very public war against the US dollar. Lula made some scathing remarks. Listen to this. And I'm quoting, "Why should every country have to be tied to the dollar for trade? Who decided the dollar would be the world's currency? Why can't a bank like the Brics bank have a currency to finance trade between Brazil and China, between Brazil and other Brics countries? Today, countries have to chase after dollars to export when they could be exporting in their own currencies." And Lula da Silva did not stop there. He trained his guns on Western financing institutions next, specifically at the International Monetary Fund or the IMF. This is what he said: "No bank should be asphyxiating countries as economies the way the IMF is doing now with Argentina, or the way they did with Brazil for a long time and every third world country. No leader can work with a knife to their throat because their country owes money. These are some very strong words, and Lula chose the perfect stage to say all of this. He picked the perfect occasion to launch his war against the US dollar. He delivered his impassioned speech at the New Development Bank, better known as the Brics Bank. Brics is a grouping. It stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, BRICS. These are the world's largest economies, largest emerging economies. Their group is called Brics. They've set up a bank called the New Development Bank. It was established in 2015. It's a multilateral development bank, and it provides financing for infrastructure and development projects. The bank has members beyond BRICS nations. They include countries like Egypt, Bangladesh, Uruguay, and the UAE. A former Brazilian president is now in charge of this bank. Her name is Dilma Rousseff. She's the bank's new chief executive. Yesterday was the inauguration ceremony, and that's why Lula was there. Under him, Brazil is taking a very aggressive stand against the US dollar. Lula believes the BRICS can offer a better alternative. So with a Brazilian at the helm of a major BRICS institution and the world order in a state of flux, President Lula is making a push for a BRICS currency. Like we've told you earlier, this idea has been around for a while. It's not new. Russia, too, has been asking the BRICS to consider this proposal. And now Lula is pushing this idea, and that too quite strongly and quite publicly. The question is, will the other members go for it? Because don't forget the China factor. Lula has been leaning towards China. Before launching a public tirade against the US dollar, Brazil and China reached an agreement of their own, a deal to trade in their local currencies and to not use the US dollar to conduct bilateral trade. So China uses the yuan and Brazil the real. This deal was sealed before Lula flew down to Beijing. And bilateral agreements like these are far easier to secure, but the idea of a larger BRICS currency is going to be a tough sell. For starters, will India support the idea? Will India work with China on a common currency? We ask this because this would encourage interdependency, and India at this point is hoping to achieve the opposite, to cut its dependence on China. So the plan for a BRICS currency may not take off just yet. But that doesn't mean that Lula is not on the right track. His statement against the dollar only echoes the larger sentiment. The dominance of the greenback is under threat, and the challengers are rising. The war in Ukraine has been on for 415 days. Who's winning it? Not Russia. Certainly not Ukraine. It's the US oil companies. They're the ones winning this war. And tonight we'll show you how. As thousands die on the battlefield, American oil companies are raking in billions. How many, you ask? Try 200 billion. And this is just in profits. US oil companies have reaped $200 billion in pure profits. The war in Ukraine shook up the energy market because the West, led by the US, sanctioned Russian oil supplies, Russian energy supplies. They restricted Russian oil and gas supplies. And US companies were the clear beneficiaries of this. We're talking about data from November 2022. That was more than 4 months ago. The earnings are still on. They're still milking this war and sharing the spoils. Oil companies are cutting big checks to their executives. Case in point, ExxonMobil. It's one of the world's biggest energy companies. Its chief executive is a man called Darren Woods. He's just got a pay raise. A dream increment, if you ask me. Woods got a salary hike of 52%. So now his salary will be almost $36 million. That's close to 300 crore rupees, the salary of a CEO. Plus there's a bonus and stock rewards. And there's a hike there too. An 80% hike, 80%. So his bonus and stock rewards will go up by 80%. And it's not like ExxonMobil is hiding any of this. The company says the bumper pay for Woods was quote-unquote reflective of record earnings and stock price performance. In other words, they're making big money. So let's pull up those numbers. Let's look at how ExxonMobil has been doing. In 2022, the company made $56 billion in profits. That's $6.3 million every hour in profits. I'll repeat that, $6.3 million every hour in profits. The shares of the company have outperformed its peers, and that too by a wide margin. They climbed by 160% last year. This is so brazen that even the US president had to speak out. Joe Biden said ExxonMobil is making more money than God. He said the profiteering by oil companies was outrageous.
Oil companies' record profits today are not because they're doing something new or innovative. Their profits are a windfall of war. The windfall from the brutal conflict that's ravaging Ukraine and hurting tens of millions of people around the globe.
But ExxonMobil is not the only company. Other major oil producers are also minting money, like Chevron. That's another major US oil producer, also the main rival of Exxon. Chevron made a record $36.5 billion. Their European peers are making big profits too, like Shell. Shell announced its biggest profits in history. This company, Shell, has been around for 115 years. And last year, they made their biggest profits ever. Profits worth $39.9 billion. British giant BP was not too far behind. It has reported $27.7 billion in profit. And these are all big numbers. They confirm what the world has known for a while. Oil companies capitalize on instability, and they are profiting from pain. American oil companies are masters of this art. Time and again, as the American war machine enters conflicts, American oil companies take home big checks. You may remember the war in Iraq. The US went to war in Iraq by selling a lie. They said Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein had WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, and that they pose a threat to the world. So America invaded Iraq, ostensibly to save the world and bring democracy. As it happened, they only helped themselves. Iraq was devastated. Saddam Hussein was killed. The Americans did not find any weapons of mass destruction, but they did find lots of oil. After the invasion, a slew of American oil companies rushed to Iraq, from ExxonMobil to Chevron and Halliburton. They all got a share of the loot. They all got access to Iraq's oil. And in the years since, American officials have admitted this. They've confirmed that the war was only about Iraq's oil. I have some statements. The first one is from General John Abizet. He's the former head of US Central Command and military operations in Iraq. Listen to what he said, and I'm quoting. Of course, it's about oil. We can't really deny that. Next, we have Alan Greenspan, the former chairman of the US Federal Reserve. He wrote this in his memoir, and I'm quoting again. I'm saddened that it is politically inconvenient to acknowledge what everyone knows. The Iraq war is largely about oil. Then there's Chuck Hagel, a former US Defense Secretary. This is what he said. People say we're not fighting for oil. Of course we are. He said it in as many words. Iraqi lives are just collateral damage. And this story is not over. It's repeating itself in Ukraine. They're feeding another war and filling the coffers of US oil companies. Have you heard about an artificial sun? Like a human-made sun that can generate power. China has made it. It's quite a feat. China's artificial sun has broken a world record. It's been able to produce power by fusion for a full 7 minutes. Fusion is the joining of two atoms. When they combine, they produce a lot of energy. And this is the energy that powers the sun and stars. Now it's being created in a Chinese lab, and they're not the only ones working on it. Fusion power can change the world. It may sound like science fiction, but it's being developed as we speak. Our next report tells you more.
It seems the world is revolving around artificial suns. From scientists to movie enthusiasts, people can't stop talking about them. Do you remember Dr. Octopus from Spider-Man? He created an artificial sun, but when it got out of control, so did he. Hopefully, real-life artificial suns won't be creating any supervillains. In fact, they might be the hero we've been waiting for. So what is an artificial sun? It's a huge machine which is capable of creating huge amounts of power. It takes hot plasma, which is a blazing combination of gases, and further heats it up to above 100 million degrees Celsius. To give you a rough idea, that's 10 times hotter than the core of the sun. This kind of heat is held in for as long as possible. That's when loads of energy is released. Hopefully, one day scientists will be able to harness it. And we'll get to why that's important. But first, let's talk about a new feat in this technology. China has broken a record. More specifically, the Experimental Advanced Superconducting Tokamak, or EAST, has. It was able to confine the superhot plasma and keep its power high and stable for a whopping 403 seconds. That's about 7 minutes. It's quite the task, about 4 times the previous record of 101 seconds. This record was also held by China. It was set in 2017. So now, not only have previous records been shattered, the world has gotten close to making fusion reactors even better. They use the same science as what happens on the sun, and it can give immense amounts of energy.
Fusion is taking two small atoms and putting them together. And in terms of the practicality of building a power plant, fusion has a number of advantages. It's much more inherently safe.
Fusion power is safe and clean. It doesn't produce radioactive byproducts. It doesn't even have harmful carbon emissions. It's also a near limitless energy source, so it can help us move away from fossil fuels. The materials used to make it are in abundance on Earth.
So fusion is one of those technologies which, if it could be harnessed, could be scaled up rapidly, to be deployed worldwide by 2050. And could make a very big difference to climate, to carbon emissions and therefore to climate change from 2050 onwards.
So this is clearly an exciting time for green energy. That's why many artificial suns are being tinkered with.
I think this is a very exciting time. People have been working on fusion for many decades. There's many milestones that are being reported in the last few years.
Last year, South Korea created an artificial sun. The world is also building its biggest artificial sun in France, with inputs from India, China, US, Europe, Japan, Russia, and South Korea. It's reportedly the most expensive science project of all time. The world is collectively working towards fusion energy. This welcomes huge possibilities. And fusion experts say it won't be long before the world gets its unlimited source of energy.
And now to Sri Lanka. It is facing its worst economic crisis, and a lot of it has to do with China, Chinese loans to be precise. But Sri Lanka is back to doing business with the Chinese. They're going to sell monkeys to China. 100,000 monkeys, because China requested for these monkeys. But why does China need them from Sri Lanka? And why is Sri Lanka selling them so willingly to the Chinese? Our next report has the answers. Recently, China approached Sri Lanka with a strange request. China said it needs monkeys, tens of thousands of them, supposedly to keep them in more than 1,000 zoos across China. And now, cash-strapped Sri Lanka is considering this request. Soon 100,000 Sri Lankan monkeys could be shipped off to China, and this would need some tweaking of laws, because Sri Lanka bans the export of all live animals. So why are they making an exception for China? To make money, perhaps. How much money? That they won't tell. The financial details of this deal are not being disclosed. But it's not just about the money. Of course, it's a big incentive given Sri Lanka's economic crisis. Every penny counts. But Colombo also wants to be in the good books of China. You could call it Stockholm Syndrome. Financial transactions with China spelled the ruin of Sri Lanka. And here they are again, selling monkeys. Experts give yet another reason, though. They say monkeys have become a menace in Sri Lanka. In fact, they're classified as pests. Sri Lanka has a population of 3 million monkeys, and they're running riot. They frequently destroy crops and make the lives of farmers incredibly difficult. Sri Lanka's monkey situation is so serious that people are now allowed to kill them in broad daylight. The country's agriculture minister, Mahinda Amaravira, gave farmers a free hand in February. He told farmers that there's no other option but to kill monkeys to control their population. Sri Lanka is famous for the tok macaque monkeys. They're endemic to Sri Lanka, meaning they're found only in Sri Lanka. But if China has its way, soon they'll also be found jumping around in Chinese zoos. Earlier this year, Colombo took away their immunity. it has removed monkeys from its protected list of species. Elsewhere, they're classified as endangered animals. The International Union for Conservation of Nature, or IUCN, has put these Lankan monkeys on its red list of endangered animals. But China says it needs them for zoos, and 100,000 of them. Here's another theory that's doing the rounds. It questions where the Lankan monkeys may end up in China, in their zoos or on their plates. Monkey meat is traditionally viewed as a prized delicacy in Chinese cuisine. It is believed to have medicinal qualities. Monkey brains are a dish only the very rich Chinese can afford. While most Chinese people view the consumption of monkey meat as boring, there is enough literature to suggest that monkey meat has been consumed in China for ages. So the odds for Sri Lanka's monkeys are not very good. Either they're sent to China, facing an uncertain future, or they're killed in Sri Lanka by a government that views them as pests.
And there they go. It looks like
The US and Russia are dangerously close to an armed conflict. This year, 2023, New Delhi will be the capital of global diplomacy. For a country as diverse as ours, with 88% of the population illiterate, it was a very big deal to write a constitution, and that too, the world's largest. Meanwhile, if we may, here's a Republic Day gift from India for the BBC. A list of suggestions for the BBC for their upcoming documentaries. Number 1, the Kohinoor and the colonial loot. Number 2, an outdated monarchy and unhealthy obsession with the royals. Number 3, racism in 2023. We're waiting.